Late autumn 1944, Columbus, Ohio. The buses rolled through streets lined with brick buildings and factories where the rumble of industry echoed like distant thunder. Inside, 58 German prisoners of war sat in silence, their shoulders hunched against the cold that seeped through the windows. Most were younger than 26, though the war had aged them beyond their years. Some still carried the dust of North Africa in the creases of their uniforms, while others bore the marks of the Russian winter etched into their weathered faces. They had crossed an ocean that felt like a bridge between two worlds, and now they were entering a third world entirely, one they couldn't begin to comprehend. Werner Schroeder pressed his forehead against the cool window glass, his breath fogging the surface. He was 23 years old, a baker's apprentice from Berlin who once dreamed of opening his own bakery, where the smell of fresh bread would fill the air every morning. His hands, calloused from kneading dough and scarred from frostbite, trembled slightly as the bus bounced over the rough American road. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 8 weeks. His ribs showed through his thin uniform like the bars of a cage. If you're watching this story unfold and wondering what happened next, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Whether you're in Columbus, Copenhagen, or anywhere in between, I want to hear from you. And stick around, because what happens in the mess hall of this particular camp will challenge everything you believe about forgiveness and the nature of human kindness. The rumors had started on the cargo ship, whispered in German between the rows of bunk beds in the hold, echoing off metal walls slick with salt water and desperation. American soldiers torture prisoners for entertainment. They feed them nothing but bread and water to break their spirits. I heard they use German prisoners for medical experiments. The camps are worse than anything we experienced in combat. Werner didn't know what to believe. He'd been indoctrinated to think of Americans as soft, materialistic, corrupted by capitalist greed. But he'd also been taught that Germany would win the war, and clearly that had been a lie. Now here he was, a prisoner in a vast country that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, a landscape so open and free that it made him feel exposed and vulnerable. Through the window, he watched Columbus roll by. Tall buildings of glass and steel, automobiles that gleamed in the afternoon light, streets filled with people who didn't look starving. Store windows displayed goods he hadn't seen in years. A woman walking a dog waved at the bus as it passed. She smiled at a bus full of enemy soldiers as if they were just visitors, just people passing through. Werner's chest tightened with confusion. Nothing about America made the sense he'd been taught. Beside him sat Ludwig Hoffmann, a former tank driver who'd survived the Battle of France and 2 years on the Russian front. Ludwig's fingers moved in an almost involuntary rosary motion, clicking through an imaginary sequence of prayers. On Werner's other side sat Josef Meyer, barely 18, who'd altered his birth documents to enlist with the Wehrmacht. Josef's eyes were hollow, his gaze turned inward toward memories that no teenager should carry. He hadn't spoken to anyone since boarding the ship 2 weeks ago. The bus slowed as it turned through a gate. Through the front windshield, Werner could see it. Camp Clinton. Rows of olive-drab wooden barracks arranged in perfect military lines stretched across the landscape like a small city of prisoners. Watchtowers rose at each corner of the compound, their searchlights ready to sweep across the grounds at night. Werner didn't know what those words meant, but he understood that they were meant to be reassuring. The guards led them toward the barracks. Werner noticed immediately that the American soldiers weren't shouting, weren't using their rifles as clubs or threats, weren't employing dogs or violence of any kind. Instead, they gave quiet instructions and occasional nods of encouragement. One guard even helped Ludwig when he stumbled on the frozen ground. Werner had slept in far worse places, but it was the smell that hit him hardest. The barracks smelled like soap, like wood, like cleanliness, not like death or decay or the acrid stench of war that had filled his nostrils for years. He sat on his assigned bunk and just breathed, trying to steady his racing mind. "This can't be real," Joseph whispered from the bunk above. "This is a psychological game. They're treating us well now, so we'll trust them and then something terrible will happen." They were being called to dinner. Werner's stomach twisted violently. This was the test. Whatever kindness they'd shown so far, this meal would reveal the truth. Ludwig grabbed his blanket tighter. Joseph's jaw clenched. They stood slowly and followed the other prisoners out of the barracks, across the frozen ground of the compound, toward a long building with smoke rising from its chimney. The mess hall, the very foundation of their understanding about hunger, mercy, and human nature, would shatter like ice beneath their feet. Some of them would weep openly, some would fall to their knees, some would discover that forgiveness exists in places where hate is expected. The mess hall doors swung open, and Werner stepped inside. Immediately, his legs felt weak. The room was cavernous, far larger than seemed possible. Long wooden tables stretched from one end to the other, benches lining both sides. But it was the smell that stopped him cold. The smell that hit him like a physical wave. Garlic, oregano, yeast, tomato sauce, and something else. Something savory and complex that his starving brain couldn't quite process. And beneath that, another smell. Spices, butter, a rich and crispy aroma that made saliva pool in his mouth. His stomach cramped so violently that he had to grip the door frame to steady himself. He hadn't encountered smells like these in so long that his senses were screaming at him in a language he couldn't translate. American soldiers stood along the walls, rifles held at rest, watching the prisoners with expressions of curious detachment. Werner searched their faces for mockery or cruelty, or the trap he was certain was coming, but all he found was the boredom of men performing routine duties. One guard yawned, another checked his watch. She looked at Werner like he was a human being instead of a prisoner, instead of an enemy, and then she did something that made his throat constrict. She smiled at him. A genuine smile, warm and welcoming, and completely unexpected, and then she began to load his tray. First came a slice of pizza, a real, genuine slice of pizza. Hot, covered with melted cheese that stretched as she lifted it onto his tray. Beneath the cheese was a rich red sauce studded with herbs he couldn't name, and the crust golden and crispy and still steaming. It was perhaps the most beautiful thing Werner had ever seen. Then came the fried chicken. 3 pieces, golden brown, still glistening with the oil it had been fried in. The skin was crispy, perfect, the kind of thing that belonged in a fantasy, not in a prison camp. Then came the corn, bright yellow kernels glistening with butter. Then a thick slice of white bread with real butter on the side. Werner didn't understand her words, but he understood her tone perfectly. He understood kindness when he encountered it. He moved toward the nearest table with the tray held before him like an offering to the gods. Around the room, other prisoners were receiving the same impossible feast, the same slices of pizza, the same golden fried chicken, the same abundance of corn and bread and butter. No one ate. 58 German soldiers sat frozen, staring at their trays like they were gazing at miracles. Ludwig's lips moved in silent prayer. Josef's eyes filled with tears that he was trying desperately to hold back. Werner looked at his pizza, at the fried chicken, unable to process what he was seeing. Then slowly, carefully, as if moving too quickly might make the food disappear, he picked up a piece of the pizza. The cheese was still warm, still slightly melted. He brought it to his mouth. The moment his teeth broke through the crust and his tongue encountered the flavors of tomato and herbs and cheese, something inside him broke. The taste was bright, tangy, rich with complexity. The crust was crispy on the outside and soft inside. The cheese was creamy and salty and perfect. Tears sprang to his eyes without his permission. A sound escaped his throat, something between a gasp and a sob. He closed his eyes and just chewed, tasting flavors he hadn't encountered in so long that he'd forgotten they existed. Then he tried the fried chicken. He bit into a drumstick, and the meat was tender and flavorful and perfectly seasoned. The skin cracked between his teeth. The meat inside was warm and succulent and tasted like hope. He opened his mouth to breathe and found himself crying openly, tears streaming down his face and dripping onto his tray. Down the table, another prisoner stood abruptly and walked to the corner of the room, unable to contain his emotions in front of others. Another prisoner didn't even try to contain his tears. He wept openly while eating, the food and the tears mixing together on his tray. Another laughed, a broken, hysterical sound mixed with sobs. The mess hall filled with the sound of grown men weeping. Werner looked down at his tray through blurred vision. This wasn't just food. This was proof that humanity hadn't been completely destroyed by war. This was evidence that somewhere in this broken world, someone had decided that even prisoners deserved to eat well, deserved to taste good food, deserved to be treated as human beings. This is what freedom tastes like, Werner whispered in German, his voice cracking. Ludwig heard him and nodded, unable to speak through his tears. The American guards stood along the walls, watching in silence. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from one foot to the other. Others looked away, finding sudden interest in the ceiling or the floor. Sergeant Patton's jaw was tight, his eyes distant and focused on some faraway point. One young guard, the red-haired one from earlier, quickly wiped his eyes when he thought no one was looking. In the kitchen window, Werner caught a glimpse of the woman who'd served him. Rosa DiMaggio. The pizza was incredible, complex, and satisfying. The fried chicken was tender and flavorful in ways that seemed impossible. The corn was sweet and fresh. The bread dissolved on his tongue. He hadn't tasted anything this good in 4 years. 4 years of hardtack and thin soup and moldy bread. 4 years of watching men waste away from hunger. 4 years of going to sleep with his stomach eating itself from the inside. And now this impossible, beautiful, devastating kindness. His body was warm, genuinely warm, not just from the food, but from the recognition of kindness. His tears had dried on his cheeks, leaving salt trails, but his mind was reeling with questions and gratitude and confusion. Who was this woman? Why was she cooking like this for prisoners? Why was she treating enemy soldiers with more care and attention than guards he'd known back in Germany? He noticed the way she moved with a kind of purposeful grace, never hurried, but never slow. He noticed that she looked at each prisoner as she served them, really looked at them, as if she was trying to see past their uniforms to the person underneath. He noticed that she hummed while she worked, a tune that sounded Italian, something haunting and beautiful. He also noticed she wore a gold wedding ring, but he never saw a husband come to collect her after her shifts. On the 4th day, Werner was assigned to kitchen cleanup duty. His English was still almost non-existent, consisting of only a handful of words he'd learned from the guards. But washing dishes required no language. He stood at the industrial sink, scalding water running over his hands, scrubbing trays and pots, and serving utensils, when Rosa approached with another stack of plates. "Thank you," she said softly, setting them down beside him. The word thank you was universal enough that Werner understood. He looked up at her closely for the first time. He could see evidence of grief etched into every line of her face. It was visible in the way her shoulders curved slightly inward, in the shadows under her eyes, in the way her hands moved with a kind of determined purpose, as if accomplishing tasks was the only thing keeping her together. He wanted to speak to her, wanted to communicate gratitude in words she could understand. It was the kind of kindness that seemed impossible coming from an American, from a person who had no obligation to treat prisoners well. Later that week, Werner learned her story. Not from Rosa herself, who never spoke about her personal life, but from Sergeant Patton during a moment when some of the prisoners were allowed outside in the yard. "Mrs. DiMaggio," Patton said, lighting a cigarette and watching the smoke curl into the cold air. "She's something special. Says feeding prisoners is what Michael would have wanted. Says she won't let hate destroy her like it destroyed so much of the world." Werner sat down on the frozen ground because his legs wouldn't support him anymore. This woman, this mother whose son had been killed by German soldiers, perhaps by men in this very camp, was choosing to feed them pizza and fried chicken with love. Not duty, not obligation, pure love. It was too much to comprehend. It was impossibly noble. The information spread through the table like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Joseph's face turned white. "That's impossible." "It's true," Werner said. "Sergeant Patton told me." For a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. The significance of what they had just learned seemed to paralyze them all. Then Ludwig stood up very slowly and deliberately. He straightened his uniform. He removed his cap from his head. He walked to the kitchen window where Rosa was loading more trays. It was like watching communion. It was like watching a sacrament. One by one, other prisoners followed Ludwig's example. They approached the kitchen window. They removed their caps. They placed their hands over their hearts. They bowed. Rosa nodded to each of them, tears streaming silently down her weathered face. But she never stopped serving. She never allowed her grief to prevent her from offering mercy. She never wavered in her commitment to treating them with dignity and kindness. He would dedicate his life to the principle that kindness was possible even in the darkest circumstances. He didn't know it yet, but that promise would reshape the entire trajectory of his life. And Rosa DiMaggio's mystery would haunt him with gratitude for decades to come. Because when the war ended and Werner tried to find her to thank her properly, he discovered something impossible, something that would make some people believe she was never quite human at all. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over, the camp was in chaos, prisoners were being processed for repatriation, ships were being prepared to carry them back to Germany, back to a nation that had been carved up and divided and transformed into something unrecognizable. Werner had asked about Rosa DiMaggio repeatedly throughout that entire day. He wanted to thank her properly. He wanted to find some way to express the profound gratitude he felt. He wanted her to know that she'd fundamentally changed him, that she'd taught him something that no war could have taught him. But when he asked the processing officer about her, something strange happened. "Mrs. DiMaggio?" the officer said, flipping through his records with confusion evident on his face. "I'm not finding anyone by that name in our employment files." "The kitchen worker," Werner insisted, struggling with the English words. "The woman. Pizza and chicken. Every night." Most of the city was unrecognizable. His family's home was gone, obliterated in the bombing campaigns. His mother had died in the raids of 19. His father and sister were alive but hollowed out by years of suffering and deprivation. Living in the basement of a partially destroyed building with several other families, Werner could have allowed himself to become bitter. He could have let the destruction feed the hate that had started the war in the first place. He could have allowed the darkness to consume him completely. But every time he felt that darkness rising, he remembered Rosa DiMaggio. He remembered the pizza and the fried chicken and the kindness of a woman who had chosen mercy. He remembered that even in war, choice existed. So Werner rebuilt, but not with hate. He rebuilt with hope. He found work as a mechanic and eventually transitioned back to his original passion. He saved every pfennig he earned. Werner looked up and their eyes met across the room. Time seemed to stop. The man's face broke into a slow, disbelieving smile. "Well, I'll be damned." Werner shrugged. Werner's heart began to pound in his chest. He recognized that voice, that bearing. Sergeant Patton. "Just Hank now," the man said, walking across the restaurant with his hand extended. "Retired from the army. Doing a Europe tour with my wife." "I tried to find her," Werner said, finally. "After the war ended, I wanted to thank her properly. I wanted to tell her how much she'd changed me. But there were no records. No one knew where she went. It's like she was never there at all." Hank nodded slowly, his expression becoming thoughtful. "Yeah, I tried too. Drove back to Camp Clinton in 1947, asked around about her. Nothing. No records, no address, no way to contact her. It's like she vanished into thin air. She taught us that forgiveness is possible." "She did," Werner agreed, raising his own glass. "And still serving peace." Hank grinned. "Still serving peace." They sat together until the sun went down outside the restaurant windows. Two old soldiers trading stories and memories bound together by pizza and fried chicken, and a mysterious woman who may or may not have been entirely human. Werner Schroeder ran his pizzeria and fried chicken house for 34 years. He never became wealthy, but he fed thousands of people with the same mercy that Rosa DiMaggio had shown him in a prison camp in Ohio. His children took over the restaurant when he retired, and his grandchildren eventually took it over after them. It still operates today, still serving food prepared according to Rosa's recipes, still teaching that mercy is stronger than hate. As for Rosa DiMaggio, no records of her employment at Camp Clinton were ever officially found. No photographs exist in the camp archives, no documentation of her hiring or her employment status. Some historians who have studied this period believe she was an unofficial volunteer who slipped through the crack of military bureaucracy. Others believe she was simply what she appeared to be, a mother and a widow who transformed her grief into grace and kindness. And some believe she was never there at all, that she was something else entirely. Peace is pizza and fried chicken served with love to people who don't deserve it. Peace is kindness offered to enemies. Peace is forgiveness that goes beyond what logic can explain. Because none of us really deserve mercy, none of us really deserve kindness. And that's exactly why mercy matters so much. That's exactly why kindness is the most revolutionary act possible. They all traced it back to that moment, to Rosa DiMaggio and her pizza and fried chicken, to the recognition that an enemy could choose to treat you with kindness, that an enemy could choose to feed you well, that an enemy could choose to see your humanity even when you wore a uniform that represented aggression and war. One prisoner, Hans Müller, became a social worker in Stuttgart. He spent 40 years helping people in poverty, treating them with the same dignity that Rosa had shown him. Another prisoner, Klaus Werner, became a religious scholar and spent his life studying forgiveness and reconciliation. He wrote 7 books exploring the theology of mercy and how it could heal even the deepest wounds created by war and conflict. Another prisoner, Otto Richter, returned to his small village and worked as a teacher for 50 years. He taught his students about the value of compassion and about the importance of treating enemies with respect. He told them the story of Rosa DiMaggio and the pizza and fried chicken every single year without fail. He said it was the most important story they would ever hear. The other guards at Camp Clinton also carried this lesson with them. Sergeant Patton, who retired from the army and lived a peaceful life, spent his final years writing a memoir about his experiences. In it, he dedicated an entire chapter to Rosa DiMaggio. He wrote about how her kindness had taught him more about human nature than any training he'd received. He wrote about how he'd spent the rest of his life trying to treat people with the same respect she'd shown to prisoners. He wrote that meeting Werner Schroeder in Hamburg, finding that pizzeria still operating according to Rosa's recipes, was one of the most profound moments of his entire life. Perhaps she was protecting her real identity, afraid that helping prisoners might be seen as disloyal or unpatriotic. Perhaps she wanted to give herself completely to this mission without bringing her real self into it. Others have suggested more mystical explanations. Some have said that Rosa DiMaggio was a spiritual being sent to teach a lesson about mercy and forgiveness, that she was an angel or a ghost or some kind of manifestation, that her purpose was to change the hearts of men who had been hardened by war, and once that purpose was fulfilled, she simply ceased to exist in the material world, that her real name wasn't DiMaggio at all, but rather she was a being of pure compassion wearing a temporary human form. Werner himself never definitively settled on which explanation he believed. In his later years, when interviewed by historians, he would simply smile and say, "It doesn't matter where she came from or who she really was. What matters is that she was there when we needed her. What matters is that she taught us that mercy is stronger than hate. Whether she was human or angel or something in between, her lesson was true." When asked if he ever stopped trying to find her, Werner would say that he never completely stopped wondering, but he came to accept that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. Some stories were meant to be about the lesson, not about solving the puzzle of the storyteller. In 2001, Werner Schroeder was 92 years old. He was still alive, still running his restaurant, though his children had taken over day-to-day operations years before. A documentary filmmaker discovered his story and wanted to make a film about it. During the interview, Werner was asked if he ever doubted the experience, if he ever wondered whether memory had transformed the story into something more mythical than real. Werner was quiet for a long time before answering. He said, "I've had 70 years to think about this. I've had 70 years to wonder if I dreamed it or imagined it. But I know it was real because of how it changed me." The documentary that was made about Werner's life was released in 2003 and won several awards at international film festivals. It brought renewed attention to the story of Camp Clinton and the German prisoners and the mysterious woman who fed them. Historians became more interested. Some traveled to Camp Clinton, which still exists as a historical site, and interviewed remaining guards and civilian workers who had been there during the war. Most of what they found matched Werner's story. The food service records showed that pizza and fried chicken were indeed served regularly. The employment records showed several kitchen workers, but none named Rosa DiMaggio. The mystery deepened rather than being solved, but the story also inspired something unexpected. After the documentary was released, visitors began coming to Werner's restaurant from all over the world. They came to see the photographs on the wall, but who had read about her or heard about her and been inspired to choose mercy instead of hate in their own lives. After Werner's death, his children maintained the restaurant exactly as he had run it. They continued to serve pizza and fried chicken, according to the recipes that Rosa DiMaggio had given him. They continued to display the photographs on the walls. They continued to tell the story to anyone who would listen. The restaurant has become a historical landmark. It's listed in guidebooks about Hamburg. It's included in educational materials about the Second World War and its aftermath. School groups visit it as part of their education about forgiveness and reconciliation. It's become a symbol of something beyond history, something about the nature of human compassion. Here's the thing that I want you to understand as you're listening to this story. The real question isn't who Rosa DiMaggio was, or where she came from, or why she chose to feed prisoners. The real question is why this story matters so much to us. Why does it resonate so deeply? Why do we keep telling it and retelling it and wondering about its truth? I think we keep telling this story because we desperately want to believe that mercy is possible. We want to believe that even in war, even when hate is everywhere, someone somewhere can choose kindness. We want to believe that one person's compassion can change the world. We want to believe that a widow who lost her son can choose to feed her son's killers with love instead of poison. We want to believe that these things are possible because if they're possible, then maybe there's hope for the world. And maybe that's exactly what Rosa DiMaggio was trying to teach. Maybe the point of the story isn't to solve the mystery of who she was, but rather to understand that you don't need to be a special person to change the world. You don't need to be a saint or an angel or something superhuman. You just need to be someone who decides that mercy matters more than revenge. You just need to be someone who chooses to feed people instead of starve them. You just need to be someone who recognizes the humanity in people you're supposed to hate. So here's my question for you. If you'd been in Rose's position, if someone from the enemy side had killed someone you loved, could you have fed them? Then hit that subscribe button for WW2 Soldiers Archive. Tell me where you're watching from around the world, whether you're in Hamburg or Houston or anywhere in between. I want to hear from you. These stories matter. These lessons matter. Your voice in the comments matters. This is history that we need to remember. This is a lesson about human nature that we desperately need to learn. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to the story of Werner Schroeder and Rosa DiMaggio and the mysterious woman in the kitchen at Camp Clinton who fed German prisoners pizza and fried chicken and taught them that mercy is stronger than hate. Remember, we always have a choice, and sometimes that choice is served on a plate with pizza and fried chicken. And sometimes that choice comes from a woman whose face we never see clearly, but whose hands have served kindness and whose heart has chosen forgiveness. Remember that story, take it with you, let it teach you, and maybe, just maybe, when you face your own choices about how to treat people you're supposed to hate, you'll remember Rosa DiMaggio. You'll remember the prisoners who wept. You'll remember that peace tastes like pizza and fried chicken served with love. I'll see you in the next story. Fencing topped with barbed wire created a perimeter that gleamed in the weak autumn sunlight. American flags snapped in the cold wind. This was it. This was where they'd spend the remainder of the war, however many days or months or years that might be. Werner's stomach cramped with hunger, fear, and a strange kind of resignation. The buses pulled to a stop and guards appeared from the barracks. American soldiers in olive uniforms, rifles held casually but with professional competence. Werner braced himself for the worst, the harsh commands, the brutality he'd heard stories about. This was the moment when kindness would end and reality would set in. All right, gentlemen, let's keep this orderly. Single file, move to your left, and walk with purpose toward the processing center. The voice belonged to a tall sergeant with a square jaw and intelligent eyes. His name tag read Patton, and though he spoke firmly, there was no cruelty in his tone. Sergeant Patton opened the bus door and gestured for the prisoners to exit. He stood with his hands on his hips, observing the line forming outside. When a prisoner stumbled slightly on the steps, Patton reached out and steadied him without making a show of it. The gesture was casual, almost invisible, but it registered. Werner understood nothing of the English words spoken, but he understood actions and tone, and the sergeant's demeanor suggested something unexpected. There was authority here, yes, but not the kind that fed on cruelty. As the prisoners filed from the buses, Sergeant Patton handed each man a thin blanket and a small bar of soap. Real soap, not the harsh lye version they'd been given on the ship. When Werner took his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. Patton didn't mock him. He simply nodded and said something that Werner would later learn meant, "You're going to be fine here. We follow the Geneva Convention to the letter," catching his arm and making sure he regained his balance before releasing him. Ludwig flinched, expecting punishment, but the guard simply patted his shoulder and pointed him toward the barracks door. Inside, the dormitory was basic but organized. Bunk beds with actual mattresses. Thin though they were, blankets already folded at the foot of each bunk. A metal stove in the center of the room that radiated actual warmth. Small windows with glass that wasn't broken. Ludwig crossed himself quietly. Maybe for once God is listening to our prayers. Werner said nothing. He was too exhausted to hope, too hungry to think clearly. All he wanted was to lie down and sleep and forget. But then a bell rang, a clear, bright sound that echoed across the entire camp. One of the younger guards, a man with red hair and an open face, appeared in the barracks doorway. He made an eating motion with his hand, fork to mouth, and pointed toward the east. Dinner. Werner could smell something cooking from a distance that made his knees feel weak. Something rich, something savory, something that seemed to promise impossible abundance. But he was afraid to hope, afraid to believe that what his nose was telling him was real. What the prisoners couldn't possibly know, what none of them could have predicted or imagined, was that in the next few minutes, they looked like men who'd been given an assignment and were simply doing their job. Single file, everyone grab a tray. Sergeant Patton pointed toward a stack of metal trays near the kitchen service window. The prisoners shuffled forward slowly, their suspicion apparent in every movement. Ludwig whispered a prayer. Joseph's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal looking for escape routes. Werner took a tray. It was still warm from being washed. He moved down the line, and then he saw them. Behind the service window stood the kitchen workers, women in white aprons. hair pulled back in scarves, serving utensils in their hands. One of them looked up and met Werner's gaze. She was perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair streaked with gray, and eyes that held both sorrow and strength in equal measure. Her name tag read, DiMaggio, in neat cursive letters. And finally, a cup of what looked like apple juice, deep amber and impossibly fresh-looking. Werner stared at the tray in his hands, his vision blurred. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. This was either a hallucination born from desperation and starvation, or it was the cruelest trick imaginable, dangling impossible luxury in front of starving men. "Go on, honey," the woman said gently, her voice warm and almost maternal. "Sit down and eat. Enjoy." He couldn't stop. He brought another piece of pizza to his mouth and ate while crying, unable to separate the two actions. To his left, Ludwig set down his fork and put his face in his massive hands. His shoulders shook with sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, from years of holding in fear and hunger and despair. Joseph buried his face in his arms, and from his curled form came the sound of a young man crying like a child. German soldiers who had survived battles and hunger and years of fear were crying in a prison camp in America because they'd been given pizza and fried chicken and dignity, not from pain, not from fear, not from any negative emotion. They were crying from mercy, from the impossible recognition that even as enemies, even as prisoners, even as representatives of a nation that had tried to conquer the world, they were still deserving of good food and kindness. She was watching the prisoners cry, and her own eyes glistened with tears she allowed to fall silently. She didn't look away. She just watched, witnessing their emotion with an expression of profound sadness and compassion. Then she turned back to the kitchen and continued her work, loading more trays with pizza and fried chicken, continuing to serve regardless of the emotional storm unfolding in the dining hall. Werner ate slowly, savoring every bite, making the food last as long as possible. The other prisoners began to eat more steadily, though tears continued to fall. Spoons clicked against plates, teeth bit into chicken, fingers wiped mouths clean. The sounds of eating filled the hall, creating a strange symphony of hunger and gratitude and rediscovered humanity. When Werner's tray was empty, cleaned completely, he sat back and stared at nothing in particular. His stomach felt fuller than it had in years. He didn't know it yet, but Rosa DiMaggio was about to reveal a secret that would transform this moment into something almost spiritual in its significance. A secret that would make some people question whether she was entirely human. But that story, the story of the woman in the kitchen, is where this narrative truly deepens. Keep watching. 3 days passed, and Werner Schroeder began to understand the routine of Camp Clinton. Morning roll call at 6 o'clock, work assignments at 7, most labor was maintenance of the camp and light construction. Lunch at noon, which was substantial and filling. More work until 5 o'clock, dinner at 6 o'clock, lights out at 9 o'clock. The routine became predictable, almost soothing. After years of chaos and uncertainty and constant danger, this predictability was deeply comforting. But it was the meals, specifically the dinners, that kept Werner alive in a way that went far deeper than mere nutrition. Every evening when the bell rang and the prisoners filed into the mess hall, Rosa DiMaggio was there, always in her white apron, always with her serving spoon, always with that same gentle but efficient manner. She loaded each tray with care, making sure the portions were generous, making sure the food was fresh. Pizza every third night, fried chicken at least twice a week, always with vegetables and bread and something to drink. Werner began to pay very close attention to her. But the English was too difficult, and his German would be meaningless to her. So instead he managed to say, "Danke, thank you." She paused, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable and strangely moved at the same time. Then she reached out and placed her hand gently on his shoulder, just for a moment before turning back to her work. That single gesture shattered something inside Werner's chest. Her son Michael, he was killed in North Africa last year. German attacks. He was part of a supply convoy that got ambushed. He suffered some, from what we were told, didn't make it to the hospital. Werner went very still. "She has an enemy in this camp?" he asked, the words coming out broken and mangled but understandable. Patton nodded slowly. "She does, and she still feeds them like they're her own sons. Every single night volunteers her time, doesn't take a dime for it." It was almost too holy to process. "How?" Werner whispered. "How does she do it?" Patton shrugged. "I asked her once. You know what she said? She said, every boy I feed might be the one who understands that love is stronger than hate. Every boy I feed might be the one who takes that lesson home after the war and makes a difference. And if just one of them does, my son didn't die for nothing." Werner put his face in his hands. That night, he sat in front of his tray. The pizza and fried chicken still warm, and he couldn't eat. He just stared at it like he was looking at something sacred. Ludwig noticed his silence and leaned over. "What's wrong, Werner? You're not sick, are you?" "She lost her son," Werner said, his voice rough and barely controlled. "To us, to German soldiers, and she's still feeding us." Ludwig set down his fork slowly. Around them, other prisoners who understood German went very quiet. He stopped directly in front of her, this massive German soldier who had killed men in 3 different countries and fought in some of the war's bloodiest battles. And then he placed his hand over his heart and bowed deeply. Lasse looked up, clearly startled, not understanding what was happening. But Ludwig's gesture needed no translation. It spoke of respect. It spoke of gratitude. It spoke of sorrow for her loss. It spoke of recognition and acknowledgement of her impossible grace in choosing mercy over vengeance. Rosa's eyes filled with tears. She nodded once, accepting his tribute, acknowledging his gesture with dignity. Then she gently gestured for him to return to his seat and eat. Ludwig walked back to the table and picked up his fork. This time when he ate, something had fundamentally changed. He chewed slowly and carefully, as if each bite was precious and deserved to be honored. Werner was the last to approach. He stood before this woman who had lost her son to men like him, this baker's apprentice, who had helped build machines of war and destruction. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only stand there holding his cap in his hands, looking at this woman who had turned grief into grace. Rosa met his eyes, and in that moment, Werner saw something that took his breath away. Her eyes were impossibly kind, impossibly knowing, like she could see straight through him to the frightened boy underneath the uniform. Like she understood every mistake he'd ever made and forgave him completely. "You're going home someday," she said softly. "When you do, remember this. Remember that mercy exists. Remember that you have a choice. You can choose love or you can choose hate. Choose love." Werner didn't understand every single word, but he understood the meaning. He felt it in his bones, in his heart, in the deepest part of his soul. He nodded slowly and bowed. Then he returned to his table with tears running freely down his face. That night, as he lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling of the barracks, listening to the soft sounds of other prisoners sleeping around him, Werner made a promise. When this war ended, if he survived, he would take this mercy home with him. He would plant it like a seed in his heart and see what grew from it. The officer looked at his papers again, shuffled through multiple files, and shook his head. "Son, we've got 5 people contracted for kitchen duty. None of them are named DiMaggio. Must be a volunteer or something. Those records don't get centralized the same way." Werner felt cold spread through his chest. "But she was here every single night for 6 months. I'm sure you're right that you remember someone," the officer said gently. "But I can't help you find her. I'm sorry." Sergeant Patton was equally confused when Werner managed to track him down before boarding the ship. "That's strange," Patton admitted, scratching his head thoughtfully. "I could have sworn she was official staff, but now that you mention it, I never actually saw her sign in or sign out. She was just always there, every evening at 5:30, gone by 8. "Where did she live?" Werner pressed desperately. Patton paused. "You know, I never asked. I just assumed she was from town. I never even got her address or anything like that." Werner asked every guard he could find. He asked every kitchen worker who remained on base. He asked every administrator who would speak with him. The answers were always the same. Nobody knew where Rosa DiMaggio lived. Nobody had records of her employment. Some guards remembered her, others didn't. It was like she had been a ghost or a phantom or something that existed only in Werner's memory and the memories of the other prisoners. The day Werner boarded the ship back to Germany, he carried 3 things: his discharge papers, which represented the end of his military service, and his identity as a soldier. A single photograph of Camp Clinton that someone had taken, showing the barracks and the compound. And a handwritten recipe for pizza sauce and fried chicken that one of the other kitchen workers had given him before he left. "Mrs. DiMaggio's recipes," the worker had said. "She made me write them down. She said they were important. She said every recipe was a recipe for peace." The journey home was long and tedious. The Germany that Werner returned to was not the Germany he'd left. Hamburg was destroyed, entire sections reduced to rubble, and skeletal remains of buildings. And in 1950, 5 years after returning to Germany, he opened a small restaurant in a rebuilt section of Hamburg. He painted the sign himself, working carefully and precisely. Pizzeria and Fried Chicken House. The name was strange in post-war Germany. American names weren't exactly popular or welcome. But Werner didn't care. He wanted to honor what he'd learned. He hung a photograph of the Texas landscape on the wall behind the counter. He learned to cook from Rosa's recipes, carefully preparing the pizza sauce with the exact herbs and proportions she'd specified. His specialty, the dish he served every single day without fail, was pizza and fried chicken, prepared with the same love and care that Rosa had shown him. The restaurant struggled at first. Germans were deeply suspicious of anything American. Wariness and lingering resentment ran deep. But Werner was patient. He served good food at fair prices. He treated every customer with genuine dignity and respect, regardless of their background or their history. He served people who had fought for the other side. He served people who had lost everything. He served people who were angry at the world. Word spread slowly through Hamburg. People began to understand that this wasn't about politics or patriotism. This was about feeding people the way they deserved to be fed, with care and mercy and love. Then came September 1953. It was a Thursday evening, a busy night. The restaurant was full of people. Werner was moving between tables, checking on customers, ensuring everyone was satisfied. When the bell above the door chimed, an American tourist walked in. An older man, maybe 60 years old, wearing a faded military jacket and a Stetson hat that had clearly seen years of wear. Saw your place and thought it couldn't possibly be the same person. But here you are. They shook hands firmly. Then, without words, they embraced, two men who had been on different sides of a war, who had found common ground in a prison camp, meeting again in a world that had moved forward but would never entirely forget the war. Hank sat at the counter. Werner served him pizza and fried chicken, prepared exactly as Rosa had taught him. Hank took one bite, and his expression became distant. His eyes focused on some memory or emotion that Werner couldn't quite identify. "Tastes just like hers," Hank said quietly. "It is hers," Werner replied. "I got the recipes before I left. I've been making it this way ever since." They sat in silence for a moment, both thinking about Rosa DiMaggio, about the woman who had fed prisoners with love, about the mercy that had changed everything for both of them. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "My wife thinks she was an angel, literally. She thinks God sent her to that camp to teach us something we desperately needed to learn." Werner smiled slightly. Maybe she was, or maybe she was just a woman who chose mercy when hate would have been easier. "Either way," Hank said, raising his glass of water like it was a toast, "she changed us. An angel? A ghost? A manifestation of what humanity could become if we chose mercy over vengeance. The truth remains uncertain and perhaps unknowable. But maybe the truth doesn't actually matter in the way we think it does. What matters is what she taught. What matters is the lesson that even in war, we have a choice. That hate doesn't have to win. That peace isn't just the absence of violence or conflict. Peace is something much more concrete and tangible than that." Other prisoners from Camp Clinton have told similar stories over the decades. They've spoken about how that single meal changed them, how they went home to Germany and built lives founded on the principle that mercy was possible. Some of them opened restaurants and businesses, some became teachers and mentors, some worked in social services and spent their lives helping others. The young red-haired guard, Tommy O'Brien, went home to Iowa and became a pastor. He spent 30 years in ministry, and according to those who knew him, he was known for his unusual approach to faith. He preached that mercy was the foundation of everything. He preached that forgiveness was stronger than judgment. He preached that the highest calling was to feed the hungry and clothe the poor and treat every person with the dignity that he had seen Rosa DiMaggio extend to German prisoners. He visited Werner's restaurant twice, once in 1960 and once in 1975. He told Werner that remembering Rosa's mercy was what made him a pastor instead of a soldier. But the mystery of Rosa DiMaggio never truly went away. Historians have tried to solve it. They've searched through military records and civilian employment records and tried to find any trace of her. They've contacted the city of Columbus, Ohio, and searched property records for any DiMaggio family. They've found several DiMaggio families, but none with a Rosa, none with a woman who worked in food service, none with anyone matching the description provided by the prisoners. It's as if she existed in a space between the official record and memory itself. She was real enough for 60 prisoners to remember her. She was real enough to change the trajectory of their lives. She was real enough to inspire one man to open a restaurant that still operates 70 years later, but she was not real enough to leave behind the kind of evidence that bureaucracy requires. Some researchers have speculated that perhaps she was a volunteer who used a different name than her married name. Perhaps DiMaggio was a stage name, or a temporary identity. Perhaps she was grieving her son so deeply that she created a temporary identity specifically for the purpose of serving the prisoners. And then she abandoned that identity when the war ended, and she no longer needed it. I know it was real because of what it made me. People don't become different people because of dreams or fantasies. People become different because of genuine encounters with mercy and kindness. Every day I serve pizza and fried chicken. Every single day I remember what it felt like to be hungry and afraid, and then suddenly to be treated with dignity. That's not a dream, that's not a fantasy, that's a memory of something real. They came to taste the food that had been served in a prison camp, 70 years earlier. They came because they needed to believe that kindness was possible, that mercy could exist even in the darkest circumstances, that enemies could choose to feed each other with love. Werner's restaurant became something more than a restaurant. It became a kind of pilgrimage site, a place where people could come and remember that humanity had possibilities beyond hate. Werner Schroeder died in 2005 at the age of 96. His obituary in the New York Times was longer and more detailed than most obituaries for German businessmen. It talked about his life and his restaurant, but mostly it talked about Rosa DiMaggio and the mystery of the woman who had fed prisoners with kindness. It talked about how one act of mercy had rippled across decades and changed the lives of thousands of people who had never been to Camp Clinton and never met Rosa DiMaggio. Could you have prepared their meals and served them with kindness? Could you have chosen mercy? Could you have looked them in the eye and fed them pizza and fried chicken like they deserved it? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear what you think. I want to know if you believe that kind of mercy is possible, and if this story reminded you that humanity still has hope. If this story made you believe that kindness can actually change the world.